Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a moment that really shook the world. We're looking at the collapse of the Soviet Union's massive intelligence agency, the KGB.
But not the slow political unraveling of the USSR itself.
Right, exactly. We're focusing tightly on the institutional implosion. Just 5 intense months in 1991 where the KGB essentially fractured.
Yeah, it was more than just shuffling boxes around. This was the state's main security arm, the shield and sword, as they called it, suddenly failing after, 70-plus years of absolute loyalty, and then morphing into something new, almost overnight.
So our mission today, for you listening, is to get granular. We've got sources that track this whole thing from the moment Gorbachev was basically betrayed and isolated, right through to how these new Russian security bodies popped up from the KGB's ruins.
The aim isn't just to map out how the KGB died, though. It's about understanding how its core function, its operational spirit, and crucially, its people, and its mandate for internal control, how all that got transferred.
Often pretty much intact, right, into the new Russia.
That's the key. And the time frame we're zeroing in on is super specific. August 91, right after the coup attempt that really exposed the cracks.
That 3-day shambles.
Exactly. All the way to December 91. It was this frantic period, the struggle over whether to actually dismantle the KGB's power or, as it turned out, mostly just absorb it.
A fight for control that basically set Russia's course for decades. Okay, let's dive in. The August coup. The 𝐃𝐄𝐄𝐏, the KGB was right at the heart of it, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely central. It wasn't just involved, it was the engine. The sources point to Sunday, August 18th, 1991. Gorbachev's down at his dacha in Foros in Crimea.
And the signal that things had gone terribly wrong wasn't soldiers kicking down the door.
No, much more insidious. 4 top officials show up, demand to see him. But the real confirmation, the chilling part, was silence. His direct communication lines to Moscow, dead. Cut off.
Surgically severed by the very people meant to protect him. That tells you everything about internal control, doesn't it?
It does. It means the 9th Chief Directorate, the Elite Protection Service, was complicit. The president's own bodyguards were part of his confinement.
Who specifically from the KGB was there?
Well, the delegation included General Yuri Plekhanov. He was the chief of security for all party and state bigwigs. His presence confirmed it. The 9th Directorate had flipped. Total betrayal at the highest level.
And the demand was straightforward. Sign this state of emergency, hand power to Yeltsin, the vice president.
Gorbachev refused point blank, called them treasonous blackmailers. But he was stuck. Lines dead, place sealed, the coup was on.
So why? Why would the KGB chairman, Vladimir Kryuchkov, the top spy, risk it all?
Kryuchkov, yeah. He was the main operator behind this group of 8 that was Merka. His motivation. It's complicated. It wasn't just rigid communist ideology. You have to remember Kryuchkov came up through foreign intelligence, the first chief directorate. He had access to the real picture.
So he wasn't just drinking the Kool-Aid. He actually knew how bad things were.
Ironically, yes. The sources are pretty clear. The KGB, unlike maybe the politicians in the Politburo, had the most accurate read on the USSR's future, or lack thereof. Their analysts saw the economic rot, the tech gap with the West, the nationalism. They knew the country was heading towards a cliff.
So it was a kind of informed pessimism driving him.
Yeah.
A desperate gamble to stop the whole thing from collapsing.
That seems to be the core of it. He genuinely seems to have believed Gorbachev's reforms, glasnost, perestroika, had opened the floodgates to, capitalist influence, internal chaos. Inside the KGB, the coup was framed as saving the state structure itself. It was fueled by grim, accurate intelligence that the system was dissolving anyway. The power of the security organs came first, maybe even before the Communist Party itself.
Which leads to this really interesting kind of dark theory that was floating around, even back then. That Kryuchkov's plan wasn't just about rolling back the clock.
Right. There was serious speculation, especially in investigative circles, that Kryuchkov wasn't really aiming to prop up the 𝐃𝐄𝐄𝐏 hardliners long-term. The idea was maybe he intended to use the coup to ditch Gorbachev, who was already looking like a spent force, and actually install Boris Yeltsin.
Yeltsin, the democratically elected Russian leader, the guy who stood on the tank. That seems completely counterintuitive.
It does, on the surface. But the theory goes that Kryuchkov saw Yeltsin as maybe the only figure who was both hardline enough and popular enough, especially with that Russian power base, to actually stabilize things, maybe hold some form of the union together. It suggests Kryuchkov was playing a very cynical, pragmatic game.
So he was willing to work with his supposed enemy.
Potentially. If it meant the Chekisti, the security apparatus, survived and kept its power, regardless of who was nominally in charge. It hints that the deep state's loyalty had already shifted, away from pure ideology towards self-preservation. It's chilling. Institutional power trumping everything else, even before the Soviet flag came down. Okay, so the conspiracy is launched, Gorbachev is locked down. But despite being run by the supposed masters of control, the whole thing just falls apart spectacularly in those 3 days.
It really did, and the fundamental flaw was misjudging the public mood. These guys, their mindset was old Soviet power structure. They just didn't get how much things had changed with democratization. Their first huge mistake, right out of the gate. They didn't manage to arrest Boris Yeltsin.
And Yeltsin being free just blew a massive hole in their plan. He became the rallying point.
Instantly, he gets to the Russian White House, the parliament building, starts issuing decrees, condemning the coup, telling the military not to obey, and crucially, people listened. Thousands of Muscovites hit the streets, started building barricades. The plotters thought they could just issue orders and Moscow would obey. They didn't grasp that public opinion, civil resistance. It was a real force now. So when the political plan stalled and the barricades went up, Kryuchkov reached for the final option. Operation Grum. Thunder. A military assault.
Yeah, planned for the night of August 20th, morning of the 21st. The idea was to use the KGB's own elite forces alpha group, Vympel plus paratroopers, to storm the White House, take out the leadership, crush the whole thing. This was supposed to be the moment where absolute loyalty kicked in.
But it didn't. The commandos refused. That refusal seems like maybe the critical failure of the whole coup. Why? Why wouldn't they follow a direct order?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Major General Karpukhin, the Alpha commander, later denied getting a specific attack order, but the reality seems to be the command structure balked. These guys were trained for violence, yes, but...
But this was different.
Exactly. The political situation was ambiguous. Who was the legitimate authority? Gorbachev. Yeltsin. The 𝐃𝐄𝐄𝐏. They were being asked to potentially mow down huge crowds of their own citizens defending a democratically elected leader, Yeltsin. The sources suggest the officers felt it lacked that clear ideological justification they might have had, say, fighting foreign spies or terrorists.
They understood the potential bloodbath.
They absolutely did. And the political fallout. They hesitated, they questioned, and ultimately they didn't move. That refusal averted a massacre and showed the KGB's chain of command wasn't absolute anymore. It snapped under the pressure.
The moment Alpha refused, the coup was dead in the water.
Pretty much. Karpukhin resigned shortly after, which underlined the breakdown. The plotters had no backup plan. By the 21st, they were being arrested. Gorbachev came back, but he was politically finished. Yeltsin, on the other hand,
he moved fast.
Like lightning. He capitalized on the chaos, the humiliation of the central government. He actually ended up accelerating the very breakup the coup was meant to prevent.
And the KGB, the institution built to protect the Union, was now tied to a sinking ship. Yay. So the coup fails, the plotters are arrested. And then comes the public reaction, this wave of outrage, which leads to that incredibly symbolic moment with the statue.
Iron Felix. Yeah, August 22nd, 1991. Huge crowds converge on Lubyanka Square, right outside KGB headquarters, that massive building at number 2, Bolshaya Lubyanka, and there's the giant bronze statue of Felix Dzerzhinsky.
The founder of the Cheka, the KGB's ancestor. He represented about almost 75 years of state security power, of state terror, really. Mm-hmm. What did it mean for the people inside the Lubyanka watching that statue come down?
It must have been utterly demoralizing, a huge psychological blow. You've got KGB officers looking out the windows as their founder, the symbol of their entire ethos, a cold head, a warm heart, clean hands, is being hoisted off its pedestal by a crane with people cheering. It was this very public, televised declaration that their legitimacy was gone. The fear was broken, at least for a moment.
That's the visible, symbolic victory. But behind the scenes, Yeltsin wasn't just celebrating. He was launching a legal attack, going after the real power, resources, and structures.
Exactly. While Gorbachev was still trying to figure out what to do with the Communist Party, Yeltsin saw it as the root of the coup. It had to go. November 6th, he bans the CPSU in Russia. And crucially, he decrees that all its assets, buildings, money, everything are nationalized. And its archives, those vast secret records, transferred to the state.
So the fight immediately pivots from ideology to who controls the stuff, the money, which kind of sets the stage for the whole chaotic privatization mess of the 90s, right?
Absolutely. But here's the crucial contrast. While the symbols are falling and the party's being dismantled, the KGB itself manages to avoid a real cleanup.
How so? There was pressure to open the archives, wasn't there?
Huge pressure. Groups like Memorial were demanding access to the imprisoned history. The new KGB head even issued a decree to stop destroying documents. But insider accounts basically confirm it was too late, or ignored. The shredders were working overtime. The purging, liquidation, destruction, and cremation of history, as one source puts it, just kept going.
Why were they so successful at covering their tracks?
Because survival for them meant two things: protecting their people and protecting their secrets. They understood that institutional memory, especially the ugly parts about internal repression, was dangerous. They managed to shield themselves, ensure that whatever came next wouldn't be burdened by a full accounting of the past.
So, democracy won the symbols, Yeltsin won the party's assets, but the security services won the battle for secrecy.
Largely, yes. They preserved their institutional core ready for the next chapter.
Okay, so after this sort of partial reckoning, the job of actually taking the KGB apart falls to one guy, Vadim Bakitin. He sounds like an interesting choice.
Yeah, a relative liberal. Appointed as the last official chairman of the Soviet KGB on August 29, 1991. His mission was basically to break up the monolith, separate out all those different functions, spying, internal policing, border guards, signals intelligence, into distinct, hopefully non-political agencies.
Trying to dismantle that all-powerful structure.
Exactly. And the old USSR KGB was formally dissolved on December 3rd, 1991. But the way it was broken up is really revealing about what survived.
Right, let's walk through that fragmentation. Where did the pieces go?
Okay, so first you've got the first chief directorate, foreign intelligence, the spies. Arguably the most professional, maybe least domestically tainted part. That gets spun off into the Central Intelligence Service, the TSSR, which very quickly just becomes the SVR, the Foreign Intelligence Service we know today. That basically kept its core espionage mission.
Okay, SVR for foreign intel. What about the internal side, the guys doing the political policing?
That was mainly the second and fifth chief directorates, domestic counterintelligence, political surveillance. They transitioned into the Federal Security Agency of the RSFSR, the Russian Federation, called the AFB. And this AFB is the direct ancestor of the modern FSB. Critically, it kept that internal security mandate, and its headquarters stayed right there in the Lubyanka.
So the internal security function remained Russian and stayed in the same building. What about the border troops? They were huge.
Massive. Almost a separate army within the KGB. They became their own thing, the Committee for the Protection of the State Border, or KOG. So that was the third main split, separating the uniformed border guards.
Was there any attempt to keep some kind of coordination across the old Soviet space?
There was, briefly. They set up something called the Inter-Republican Security Service, the MSB, in late October 91. The idea was it would coordinate between the security services of the newly independent republics.
But it didn't last.
Failed spectacularly. Lasted about a month, maybe 6 weeks. Russia, under Yeltsin, essentially just swallowed it up. Its functions, its staff, its resources got absorbed into the Russian AFB, which itself was about to be renamed the MBR, the Ministry of Security.
So even as they were fragmenting the old KGB, Russia was already consolidating control over the key pieces on its own territory.
Precisely. It wasn't just about liberal reform. It was about Russia inheriting the bulk of the Soviet security infrastructure, pretty much unilaterally. No real sharing with the other former republics. Russia made sure it held the main levers of security power from the outset.
This period of fragmentation under Bakitin, this sort of liberal moment, it seems like it was incredibly short-lived. Because Yeltsin himself, the hero of democracy, almost immediately tried to reverse course.
Yeah, this is a really critical turning point. It shows how strong that pull towards centralized security power is, regardless of ideology. Just weeks after the KGB is formally dissolved, Yeltsin issues this decree, and it's a shocker.
What did it do?
He tried to merge the new domestic security agency, the AFB, with the regular police, the Ministry of Internal Affairs, the MVD, create one super ministry. The Ministry of the Security and Internal Affairs, the MBR-MVD.
Wow, that sounds familiar.
Exactly. The reaction was immediate. Liberals, journalists, deputies, they went ballistic. They instantly saw the parallel to Stalin's NKVD, that terrifying organization that combined secret police, regular police, counterintelligence, labor camps, everything. It was the ultimate instrument of state terror.
So the fear was recreating that kind of monster, even under a supposedly democratic government.
That was absolutely the fear. It suggested that this belief, this sort of authoritarian default that you need a massive unified security fist to govern effectively, hadn't died with communism. It was still there, under the surface.
But this time there was a pushback.
There was, and this is significant. Russia had just established a constitutional court, and that court took up the case. They reviewed Yeltsin's decree and, remarkably, declared it unconstitutional. They ruled he couldn't just create such a powerful entity by presidential decree alone.
A real check on executive power. So Yeltsin had to back down.
He did. He had to annul the merger decree. It was a rare, maybe fleeting victory for judicial oversight against the security state, but Yeltsin didn't give up on the goal of re-centralization. He just got smarter about it.
How so?
He couldn't do the big merger, so he did it piecemeal. He started systematically rolling back Bakitin's reforms bit by bit, often through less visible decrees.
Pulling the pieces back under the main security agency's umbrella.
Exactly. By January 92, barely a month after the court ruling, the main security agency, now called the MBR, got military counterintelligence back. That's a huge chunk of power.
And the border guards?
6 months later, they were back too. The KOGG was folded back into the MBR. So within about half a year, Bakitin's attempt to create functionally separate, potentially less political agencies, largely undone.
So the Russian successor agency ended up looking structurally very similar to the old KGB anyway.
Very similar. Domestic counterintel, internal political control, military counterintel, border forces, all consolidated again, still headquartered in the Lubyanka. The liberal experiment was effectively reversed. The security structure remained huge, centralized, and ultimately answered to the president.
Okay, so the structures were rebuilt, or at least reassembled. But what about the people? Thousands of trained KGB officers suddenly, theoretically, out of a job. What happened to them? This seems like a massive human capital issue.
It's arguably the defining legacy of the collapse, shaping so much of post-Soviet Russia. For many, especially in specialized roles like foreign intelligence or technical fields, it was just a name change. They stayed on, transitioned smoothly into the SVR or the new domestic agency, the FSB. You know, KGB illegals overseas just became Russian illegals. Some places, like Belarus, didn't even bother changing the name KGB.
But that couldn't account for everyone. The KGB was enormous. What about the mid-level guys, the administrators, the regional officers?
That's where you get this massive, uncontrolled privatization of intelligence skills. These weren't just ideologues. They were people with very practical, marketable abilities: surveillance, analysis, logistics, managing complex operations, security protocols, understanding money flows, even coercion.
Skills that were suddenly very valuable in the chaotic new Russia.
Incredibly valuable. With the old controls gone, they took those skills and went where the money was. Into the booming private sector, private security firms exploded, banks needed security, and people who understood sensitive transactions.
And less savory destinations, too.
Absolutely. Many found niches in or working alongside the rapidly growing organized crime syndicates, the Bratva. The lines blurred incredibly quickly. You had this bizarre situation where the guys who theoretically should have been fighting organized crime were sometimes the same guys providing the expertise, or at least turning a blind eye.
A devastating paradox. The security elite basically leveraged their old skills to become the new economic elite, or at least powerful players in that world.
That's a huge part of the story of the 90s. And it leads directly to the rise of the Siloviki, this powerful group drawn from the military, security, and intelligence backgrounds who came to dominate Russian politics and business.
And the prime example, of course, is Vladimir Putin.
The textbook case. Lieutenant Colonel served abroad in Dresden for the first Chief Directorate, then Domestic Counterintel, Directorate Z, back in Leningrad. He actually resigned from the KGB during the coup attempt, August 20th, 1991.
Made a clean break, ostensibly.
Outwardly, yes. Went into city politics in St. Petersburg under Anatoly Sobchak, a classic example of leveraging that Chekist background and connections outside the formal structures. And then his rise was just phenomenal.
Back into the federal system.
Right up to the top. By 1998, Yeltsin appoints him director of the FSB, the main domestic successor to the KGB, then secretary of the Security Council. It cemented the Siloviki ascendancy. These weren't just politicians. They were people with deep roots in the security state, often using those connections to gain control over key state assets, especially in energy and resources.
So the KGB didn't really die. Its people just adapted and conquered.
In many ways, yes. They became the new power class.
So looking back at that intense 5-month period, August to December 91, what's the main takeaway? It sounds like the death of the KGB was more like a rebranding and restructuring, not a real defeat.
That's the core conclusion, I think. The KGB wasn't truly vanquished. It fragmented, yes, it reorganized. But ultimately, its key functions and personnel were absorbed, largely intact, by the new Russian state. The failure in August 91 wasn't because it lacked power. It failed because Kryuchkov and the plotters misread the public, and crucially, because their own elite units hesitated to carry out mass violence against citizens.
That hesitation was the key democratic moment, in a way.
It was the critical factor that prevented a bloodbath and allowed the political transition to happen, messy as it was.
We talked earlier about that powerful symbol, the Dzerzhinsky statue coming down on August 22nd. It really looked like a definitive break with the past.
It looked like it, and it felt like it to many people at the time. But symbols can be misleading. The institutional culture, the Chekist ethos, it wasn't purged, and you see evidence of that continuity later on.
How so?
Well, the sources point out that years later, a new Dzerzhinsky monument was actually erected at the headquarters of the SVR, the Foreign Intelligence Service. It's a pretty clear signal, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, it suggests the identity persisted. Cold head, warm heart, clean hands. Just found a new master.
Exactly. The shield and sword didn't disappear. They just switched allegiance from the Communist Party to the new Russian executive branch.
It really underscores how institutions, especially powerful security ones, can endure even massive political change.
It does. And perhaps the biggest failure of that transition wasn't dissolving the KGB itself that probably had to happen. The real failure, maybe, was the inability of the democratic forces, including the courts, despite that one victory, to put lasting institutional checks in place to prevent the security power from reconcentrating so quickly.
Yeltsin's piecemeal rebuilding of the security apparatus, even after the court ruling, showed that the underlying drive was still there.
Right. It showed a belief that effective state power requires a dominant, largely unchecked security service, almost irrespective of the stated political system.
Which leaves a pretty provocative question for you, the listener, to think about. We saw the Russian Constitutional Court make a brave stand, checking the executive's attempt to create a new NKVD. But what happens when the executive just finds other ways, smaller steps, to achieve the same goal of re-centralizing security power? Does that initial legal victory ultimately mean much if the institutional momentum towards consolidation is relentless? How do you truly reform a security state when its legacy and core functions seem designed to resist democratic oversight?
A sobering thought about the persistence of power structures.
Indeed. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the complex end and perhaps rebirth of the KGB. We'll see you next time.